Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ryan Hall, and I am the Director of Marketing for Lighthouse AI, a pharma solutions company. We welcome you to today's webinar, How Critical Facility Details Determine State Licensing Requirements. Before we dive into the main content, we'd like to provide you with some additional information to ensure you enjoy the webinar. First, please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand. We'll distribute the recording via email to all attendees in the next 24 hours. By default, all attendees' audio and video are turned off to minimize background noise and distractions. And the chat function will also be disabled for today's webinar. However, you can submit questions anytime for the questions and answer session at the end of the webinar, and you can find that button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Our team will answer those questions during the designated Q&A session, again at the end of the webinar. Also, we'll introduce a few poll questions throughout that will help us add to today's webinar content, drive engagement, and reveal how common or severe the challenges are that we are discussing today. And this will also help us with part of our ongoing market research. And don't worry, all the answers will remain anonymous. So let's cover today's agenda, what we'll be discussing. We're going to start with some terminology. So we'll create some general framework and discuss some of the terminology we'll be using during today's webinar. We'll discuss why this step matters, and that step is capturing facility details. We'll show you how to capture facility details and the problems that you may face in capturing those facility details. We'll also discuss some alternative solutions. All right, and let's talk about Lighthouse AI. If this is your first time joining, Lighthouse AI provides state licensing software and services to help companies in the pharmaceutical supply chain fulfill their state licensing requirements. Lighthouse AI was born out of Pharma Solutions, a consulting and services company started in 2015 by our CEO and founder, Sumeet Singh. We have assisted over 700 clients and manage over 13,000 licenses for pharma manufacturers, distributors, 3PLs, pharmacies, and more. Now to introduce today's speakers. Sandy Carter is the Senior Manager of Intelligence Research and Development with Lighthouse AI, and she has over 10 years of experience in the pharmaceutical life sciences industry. And she specializes in high-quality compliance research across manufacturers, wholesalers, and 3PLs. Also joining us today is Mark Fulton. Mark is the Senior Manager of Regulatory Intelligence. Mark is a licensed pharmacist and pharmacy compliance expert with over 20 years of experience spanning pharmacy operations, health IT, product leadership, and regulatory strategy. Before we get started, a quick legal disclaimer. The information provided today is subject to change and is intended as use as informative industry knowledge. We are not a law firm and do not provide legal advice. With all that being covered, we'll get started, and I'm going to hand it over to Mark to discuss terminology.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'll be taking a moment here to briefly clarify some of the terminology that we'll be using throughout today's webinar. We'll use the term state licensing to refer to licenses required by all the agencies across all U.S. states and territories. State licensing refers to all the licenses that are issued to our clients, including manufacturers, wholesalers, and others, whether you're a resident or a non-resident of that state. When we talk about state licensing professionals, what we're referring to is the folks who manage state licensing for companies in the pharmaceutical supply chain. So if you are the one who manages state licensing for your company, we are referring to you when we say state licensing professionals. And if that's not you, we are referring to the person who does. Facility details. So facility details are the characteristics about a particular facility. You can think of this as a business location. And these are the characteristics that determine the types of licenses you need, what licenses you need, and where. And these details can be divided into 4 categories: operating jurisdictions, product ownership, physical movement of products, and your product portfolio itself. And we'll go over each of these in depth and look at how they can affect licensing. So we'll start with jurisdictions. A jurisdiction refers to the geographic scope of a state rulemaking authority. A state's jurisdiction encompasses all of the business activities that take place within their borders. Now, this includes both in-state and out-of-state entities. Your jurisdiction also impacts your residency. You may be a resident or a non-resident. The state of your residence is determined by a facility's physical location. And this matters because the type of license that you need can actually vary depending on whether you're a resident or a non-resident of a given state. In Texas, for example, resident manufacturers are licensed as manufacturers, but non-resident manufacturers actually are licensed as wholesalers. Another thing that impacts your facility details is your product portfolio. This is the list of products that you carry, that you deal with. The license needs are really determined in large part by the products that your facility buys, sells, handles, or transports. Across the country, state level rules about handling different products varies significantly, both with regards to which products are regulated and how they are regulated. They can also differ on who does the regulating. For example, some states will regulate durable medical equipment through the Board of Pharmacy, while others have a separate DME board that handles that regulation. It's very important to have a solid understanding of all the products that a facility handles to accurately determine which licenses are needed for each jurisdiction. Another factor that determines your licensing needs is shipping and selling, where your product goes. A traditional wholesaler business model, for example, will both sell and ship a product. But these two actions are not necessarily the same. A manufacturer might sell a product into a state, but outsource the shipping to a 3PL. In this instance, the 3PL will be shipping the product, but would not be the seller. For virtual manufacturers and wholesalers, the rules can vary from state to state. These business models will sell a product into a state, but don't physically touch the product at all. Some states will require a license for non-resident virtual manufacturers, while others, like Missouri, for instance, do not. Some states even look beyond selling and shipping and require a manufacturer to hold a license if their product simply ends up in that state through any means of distribution. In these situations, the state is concerned with the manufacturer's connection to the product. Consider, for example, a virtual manufacturer whose product is sold to a wholesaler and then shipped into Alabama. The wholesaler holds the title, but the virtual manufacturer is still required to have an Alabama license because their name is listed on the product label, even though they neither sold nor shipped their product into the state. Now, this is an example of what we call title model. A title model is where manufacturers will sell a product to a 3PL who takes complete ownership, takes title of that product, and and then sells it under their wholesaler license. Even though the manufacturer, in this case, completely outsources the selling and shipping, they still may require licensure because they appear on the product label. Another important thing to consider when we look at facility details is ownership. And we talked about the title model there. Ownership refers to holding the title to a product legally, and if you own it, you can then pass it to another owner. It's what gives a business legal authority to determine the sales and distribution of a product. Now, physical possession is not necessarily the same. Physical possession is the literal stewardship of a product, regardless of who owns it. For example, a 3PL or a contract manufacturer, they often possess a product, but they don't own it. They simply physically possess or manufacture a product on behalf of another entity. A virtual manufacturer, on the other hand, has ownership of a product but does not physically possess it. So, ownership and possession, not necessarily the same. And whether you need a license can often depend on whether the regulations are based on ownership or possession. For instance, in Missouri and Colorado, a license is required for whoever is physically transporting product into that state. And it's not about ownership. It's about who last touched the product before it entered the state's border. In short, your facility license requirements are determined by a combination of where you're located, the products you deal with, where they are sold and shipped, and the chain of custody throughout the process. So, state licensing requirements. Each license applies to a very specific combination of facility details. It's crucial that the state licensing professionals in your organization capture all of the facility details that determine each facility's state licensing requirements. Now, facility details determine two very important points in state licensing. They determine how an agency defines a facility's business model and whether or not that facility requires a license that applies to that business model. Some states will actually define business models with explicit clarity, while others have more general definitions. It's very important to be familiar with these definitions because your organization could actually be defined differently from one state to the next, and that impacts the type of licenses that you need in order to operate. For example, Washington State, they issue both a wholesaler and a manufacturer license. But which type you need hinges on whether you're a resident or a non-resident. If you're a resident, you would need a pharmaceutical manufacturer license. That only applies to in-state facilities. If you're out of state and you're a non-resident manufacturer, you need to be licensed as a wholesaler. So this boils down to having a clear picture of your specific business activity and how that lines up with the state's regulatory definitions. That is a major factor in understanding how any given state might categorize you for licensure. Your facility details not only determine how an agency looks at your business model, but also whether or not you do need a license for a specific business activity. For example, not all manufacturers must acquire licenses with manufacturer in the name of the application. This is because some licenses only apply to specific details that aren't universal across the same business model across states. And remember, it's not just about what your facility does. The license needed for your facility will depend also on the specific products you deal with and how they're shipped and sold. Another example here is state-specific regulations on controlled substances. We have drugs like gabapentin and xylazine that are not defined as controlled substances at the federal level, but have been added to state-level controlled substance definitions. And that will implicate how you need to handle these different drugs depending on the jurisdiction that you're in. And that covers my terminology overview, and I'll hand things back to Ryan.
Great. Thanks, Mark. All right, everyone. I mentioned earlier we're going to be conducting a few polls throughout the webinar today, just to gather a little information. It's always kind of interesting as the audience is always different and we get some different results. The poll should be up on your screen now. What I'd like to find out is what percentage of facility details do you believe the typical company incorrectly captures? Your best guess is fine, and just a reminder that your answers will remain anonymous. So appreciate all your participation, and we'll actually take a look at the results in just a moment. Just give everyone a chance to answer the poll now. So perfect. Answers are rolling in. I'm going to close that poll, and let's take a look at the results. All right, perfect. So it looks like the majority of people said that they believe that 10 to 19% of facility details are captured incorrectly. A few folks thought that 1 to 9% was the correct answer, and a few folks that said about 30% or more. All really good guesses, but we're actually going to reveal the answer to that in just a moment. So thank you everyone for participating in that poll. I'd like to pass things over to Sandy to discuss why this step matters and reveal the answer to that poll question. Over to you, Sandy.
Thanks, Ryan. Capturing facility details is the most consequential step in managing state licensing because the accuracy of everything else depends on getting this step right. In fact, in our experience, state licensing professionals incorrectly capture 30% of facility details. And by that, I mean state licensing professionals fail to confirm or are unaware of business activities they are actively conducting, such as manufacturing, selling, shipping products into specific states. Or state licensing professionals confirm that that the facility conducts business activities that they are not actively conducting. Most mistakes are the latter problem. They confirm that a facility does not have details it does have. When organizations overlook facility details, they fail to acquire the licenses that they need. In fact, based on our research, the typical pharmaceutical company fails to obtain 15% of necessary licenses that they need because they fail to capture the facility details completely and correctly. Not having necessary licensure has serious consequences, including lost sales and revenue. If an organization receives a cease and desist order from a state agency, its trading partners will typically shift their business to other organizations and pause or discontinue activity with the affected entity until the issue is resolved, which can take an average of 3 to 4 months. A cease and desist order not only interrupts business operations, but it also triggers extensive additional reporting obligations to state regulators. Not just the issuing state, but also other states that require disclosure of any disciplinary actions taken against the organization in any jurisdiction. Now let's talk about fines. For state agencies, fines can be between a few hundred and several thousand dollars. For federal agencies such as the DEA, the fines could be up to the millions of dollars. In regards to legal fees, legal fees can be associated with any step of the state licensing life cycle, from the identification of necessary licenses to the resolution of disciplinary action. Cease and desist often require organizations to hire outside legal counsel. Lost businesses, lost business with trading partners, and reputational harm. Those are the consequences of not acquiring a license. Here are the consequences of acquiring licenses that you don't need. Pharmaceutical companies that obtain licenses they don't need waste time and money and can implicate themselves in other states if there's any issue with the unneeded license. In regards to wasted time, pharmaceutical companies waste at least 6 hours per license to interpret the application, confirm the required prerequisites, gather the attachments, complete the application, review the application, submit the application, respond to deficiencies, and monitor for approval. Not only do pharmaceutical companies waste time acquiring licenses they don't need, they waste money. Pharmaceutical companies potentially waste $1,000 to $50,000 per license. The low end of this range includes fees for the application plus staffing costs to acquire and manage the licenses. The high end of this range includes the following: fees for renewing the license, costs to file reportable changes on that license. There are often substantial costs associated with acquiring prerequisites to some license, such as NEBP drug accreditation, which can take up to a year, requiring a DR or PIC to obtain a personal license, registering with the Secretary of State, which may require setting up your business in each state where you operate. This usually involves paying filing fees, submitting periodic reports, appointing a registered agent. There are also ongoing requirements to keep your business in good standing and your information up to date. Potential disciplinary actions on the unnecessary license, fines for not filing or reporting changes to a particular agency, and then legal fees to resolve cease and desist or other disciplinary action. Pharmaceutical companies often face these consequences for licenses that weren't even required. Wasted time and wasted money is what is at stake, meaning what's at stake if a state licensing professional doesn't correctly and completely capture facility details. Now let's unpack why pharmaceutical companies incorrectly and completely capture facility details. I'm going to hand it over back to Mark.
All right. So, to explain a little bit about why pharmaceutical companies might make mistakes when capturing facility details, and to explain that in context, we actually need to zoom out for a moment. State licensing professionals capture facility details to determine which state licenses a facility has to acquire. So, unless they've outsourced this work to a third-party vendor, state licensing professionals typically complete these following steps when they compile a list of all the requirements for a given facility. They start by determining which jurisdictions that facility does business in. Then they look at which agencies in each jurisdiction require licensing for pharmaceutical companies. Once they have that, they determine how each agency defines the business model for each facility based on those facility details. They then identify the licenses that apply to the business model for each facility in each relevant jurisdiction. They then assess the details for each state licensing requirement to determine whether a facility must comply with each requirement, which ones are applicable. Then they need to confirm whether a facility has all of the details that require the license. And finally, they need to document why the facility decided to incur the cost of acquiring a license or chose not to acquire a license and what risk that may expose them to. Now, although state licensing professionals typically carry out the steps in that order, we actually recommend completing step 6, confirming those facility details, much earlier in the process. And this process is repeated again and again for each facility and jurisdiction. There's a lot of steps here and a lot of opportunity for error throughout the process. And one of the biggest issues we often see relates to timing. It's really critical to determine which license types are required much earlier on in the process. That's why we recommend putting the facility detail confirmation much closer to the beginning. Without doing this, you may actually end up submitting an application with non-refundable fees that you don't even need, or missing out on a license that you do need, which will delay the ability to sell or ship a product into a given state. In order to get all this information, state licensing professionals will typically need to connect with multiple stakeholders across the company to identify all of those facility details that determine state licensing requirements. This may be folks like the facility leader, your DR, regulatory affairs, legal team, so on and so forth. In our experience, this process typically takes 5 to 10 interactions between the state licensing professional and other internal stakeholders. Now, each of those interactions, emails, phone calls, in-person meetings, they consume valuable time and effort, and just to confirm facility details that determine your licensing requirements. But it's not just a one-time process. This needs to be repeated every year or every 2 years, on and on and on. All right, so I'll pass things back over to Ryan now for another poll question.
Great. Thank you, Mark. All right, everyone, this one is more directly related to your experience rather than an estimate on the average company. Um, so, how often do you or your internal stakeholders meet to capture facility details? Do you meet less than once a year, once per quarter, twice a year, or once a month? I'll leave the poll open for just a few moments. Appreciate everyone's participation for a good sample size. Really curious to see the response on this one. Perfect. All right, great. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Thank you, everyone. Let's take a quick look at the results. Um, Great. Answers are a little across the board, which is to be expected. But what I'd like to say is we highly recommend meeting at least once a year, if not more, to capture facility details, and we'll explain why in a minute. I'm going to hand things back over to Sandy to discuss incorrectly capturing facility details.
Thanks, Ryan. Um, Two challenges commonly arise in this step of the state licensing process. One is state licensing professionals often do not have or even know all the right questions to ask internally. Or two, licensing professionals face challenges internally with their organization when confirming facility details. With requirements varying across all jurisdictions, it is common for licensing professionals to be unfamiliar with the full range of agency rules and nuances, including the differences not only among states, but also between state and federal regulations. The result is that state licensing professionals may overlook an agency requirement because they did not know to even look for it. They also will not ask about those facility details when confirming with internal stakeholders. Here are a few examples of those nuances. Agencies other than the Board of Pharmacy. In 5 states, agencies other than the Board of Pharmacy, including the Bureau of Narcotics, require controlled substance licenses for gabapentin. Another distribution licensure. Some states will require manufacturers that ship product to be licensed by as a distributor, while others will only require their 3PL to be licensed. And then reverse distributors. Licensure may be required for an entity that obtains unused, unwanted, or expired pharmaceuticals for either return or for the manufacturer or for physical destruction. And now for the second problem we mentioned. State licensing professionals face challenges internally with their organization when confirming facility details. When confirming facility details, certain aspects of the process can lead to state licensing professionals to make incorrect determinations on whether specific details apply to a facility. The core issue is the current process does not allow these details to be verified with certainty. As a result, state licensing personnel may incorrectly conclude that a facility does or does not meet certain requirements. In regards to stakeholders, often state licensing professionals struggle with finding the appropriate point person to gather the information needed to even determine the full picture of what is happening at the facility. Often, the designated representative, facility manager, or pharmacist in charge is the person best able to provide this information. Sometimes a company must go to more than one individual to really ascertain what is happening at the facility and what is going on with their products. Individuals make mistakes, and because state licensing professionals do not meet with stakeholders as a group to confirm facility details, stakeholders do not confirm their answers with each other. In regards to emails, questions about facility details can be answered incorrectly in email for 2 reasons: misinterpreted delivery of questions and information, and misinterpreted responses. Limited time. 15 minutes is just not enough time to confirm. A lot of the individuals for whom the information must be gathered have limited time, and they can't take time to confirm the question was asked correctly, confirm the question was heard and understood correctly, or confirm that answer with someone else. Stakeholders and state licensing professionals become frustrated and fatigued by the process of asking and answering questions about facility details. That's because facility leaders are randomly disrupted with questions about facility details many times. Stakeholders can become frustrated with the process, causing state licensing professionals to hesitate to confirm with 100% certainty each facility detail. And the mistakes start when state licensing professionals start making assumptions without 100% certainty. Pharmaceutical companies should meet more than once a year to capture facility details. That's because an average of 10% of facility details change during one year. And those changes could require new licenses. And not only are there changes inside the facility, there are changes outside the facility, meaning new and changing licenses that apply to other facility details that previously did not determine licensing requirements. We estimate 30 to 40% of jurisdictions make significant changes in their licensing requirements each year. Over 40% of states require license renewals every year, and why we highly recommend completing this process at least quarterly because organizations can have changes to their facility details that impact their licensing requirements and renewals. I'm going to pass things back over to Ryan for one more poll question.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. Okay, everyone. Third poll question of the day. Now that we've thoroughly covered the difficulties and challenges in capturing facility details, I'd like to find out from yourself, what percentage of state licenses do you think most companies could be overlooking right now? Again, your best guess is fine. Just curious what everyone thinks that the average company, how the average company would answer this. Perfect. All right, answers are rolling in now. We'll take a look at the results in a moment. Perfect. All right, great. Thanks for the responses, everybody. Let's share those results. Answers are in. 43% of people thought that companies are overlooking 1 to 5% of licenses. 29% thought that companies are overlooking 20% of licenses or more. Let me go ahead and close that poll. And to follow up on that, if you happen to remember this from our email invite for this webinar, our research shows that the average company overlooks 15% of required state licenses due to incorrectly capturing facility details. All right, great. Now we're going to talk about alternative solutions. So how do state licensing professionals deal with these problems today? Well, most people don't solve these problems because they don't know about the problems. They don't realize they haven't captured facility details, or they don't realize they've captured facility details incorrectly, or they don't realize that facility details have changed since they last confirmed them. The solution to solving this problem is what we call a facility assessment questionnaire. A facility assessment questionnaire is a list of questions that licensing professionals use to correctly and completely document all facility details that require licenses. Now, there are 3 kinds of facility assessment questionnaires. First, there are questionnaires created by the state licensing professionals who manage licensing for their own company. Second, there are questionnaires created by state licensing vendors or consultants. And third, there's another type of questionnaire that we're going to discuss a little later. So allow me to start by explaining questionnaires created by state licensing professionals who manage licensing for their own company. An experienced state licensing professional will create their own facility assessment questionnaire to compile a list of facility details to determine state licensing requirements. The benefit of this solution is that it is more complete due to state licensing professionals' experience and will help capture far more facility details than not using a questionnaire at all. And this questionnaire is concise because your state licensing professional compiles questions that are relevant to your business model and excludes questions that are irrelevant. However, there are 2 cons to this. First, facility assessment questionnaires created by state licensing professionals are often incomplete. However, this is not their fault. These questionnaires are incomplete because there are over 700 licenses across over 80 licensing agencies across all U.S. jurisdictions. Most state licensing professionals do not have the time or resources to completely and accurately analyze the facility details and requirements for all 700 licenses. It's simply too much for one person or even a small team of licensing professionals to handle. However, that's the work that's required to compile a complete list of facility details that determine state licensing requirements. Second, these questionnaires are also prone to being outdated. That's because regulatory agencies are constantly creating or amending state licensing requirements. And state licensing professionals, again, don't have the time or resources to continuously monitor all new or changing licensing requirements and also manually compare them to facility details accurately. For example, in the month of January, our research department identified over 2,000 notifications from agencies, simply too much information to analyze manually. Manually compiling and updating those details also leaves a lot of room for error and causes state licensing professionals to incorrectly determine state licensing requirements. And because these questionnaires are incomplete and prone to being outdated, state licensing professionals face many of the very same problems we just discussed today. So let's talk about the second kind of questionnaire, one provided by a state licensing vendor or consultant. Many companies in the pharmaceutical supply chain outsource their licensing to a state licensing vendor or consultant. These vendors have compiled a list of facility details that determine state licensing requirements, and then they created the questionnaire that they use to determine those facility details. In fact, these questionnaires are so comprehensive that they usually include over 100 different questions and can be daunting for any company to complete. But there are many pros to that type of questionnaire. Unlike questionnaires created by internal state licensing professionals, questionnaires created by vendors are more complete. Vendors, with their fully staffed and dedicated teams, take the time to review those 700 plus state licenses across all agencies, and they help you capture all the facility details each license applies to and compiles all those details for you. A complete questionnaire by a state licensing vendor enables state licensing professionals to confirm all facility details with even greater accuracy. Now, with all the pros, there are still some cons. These questionnaires by state licensing vendors are static, meaning the assessment only captures your facility activities, product portfolio, and other details that affect your licensing at a specific moment in time. Once an operational or product portfolio change occurs at your facility, that assessment becomes obsolete. If your facility details change, your licensing requirements change. And according to our market research, approximately 10% of facility details change within 1 year. So state licensing professionals will overlook those 10% of changes to facility details unless they're meeting with facility stakeholders to capture those changes. Additionally, there are changes occurring outside of your facility related to new or changing licensing requirements. Regulatory agencies are constantly adding or amending state licensing requirements. However, once a state licensing vendor delivers the questionnaire, that questionnaire doesn't change and quickly becomes outdated. That's because the state licensing vendor's questionnaire is also static, just like the internal state licensing professionals. And that means that new or changing requirements issued by regulatory agencies that apply to your facility aren't captured or documented and lead to missed licenses or state requirements. Now, because of the problems still persist with employee state licensing questionnaires and traditional state licensing vendor questionnaires, we created a third option. The third option is the LighthouseAI state licensing software facility assessment questionnaire. Unlike questionnaires created by state licensing professionals or vendors, the LighthouseAI facility assessment questionnaire is complete, concise, and continuously updated, solving all the problems we talked about on the webinar today. So now I'm going to hand things over to Tessa Farley, our LighthouseAI training specialist, who will provide a brief demonstration to show you how our LighthouseAI state licensing software solved these problems today. Over to you, Tessa.
Thanks, Ryan. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So now let's talk about how the Lighthouse AI facility assessments capture critical facility details and determine your state licensing requirements. State licensing professionals first complete the Lighthouse AI facility assessment questionnaire, part of which is shown on the screen now. A full team of Lighthouse AI researchers built this facility assessment questionnaire by reviewing all of the 700 plus state licenses that are issued by all of the different agencies across all United States jurisdictions. That same research team then compiled a list of all of the facility details that those 700 plus licenses apply to. Facility details are the unique characteristics of your facility, such as the business model, your product portfolio, product ownership, and physical possession of the product. Then they built the questionnaire, which enables you to completely capture all facility attributes that determine whether a facility requires each of those 700 plus licenses. Starting with the question of which business model or models pertain to your facility and which jurisdictions products are sold into, shipped into, or simply end up. More specifically, the Lighthouse AI questionnaire was created to determine your most crucial facility details that determine state licensing requirements with just 5 main criteria. Starting with your business model, whether it is a traditional or a virtual manufacturer for both pharmaceuticals and medical devices, wholesale distributors, third-party logistics providers, and various pharmacy types. Followed by your product portfolio, including everything from over-the-counter and prescriptions to medical devices, as well as state-regulated products like gabapentin, and federal regulated products, including controlled substances and list chemicals. Finally, the states and the additional jurisdictions that products are sold into, shipped into, or simply end up. Once you've completed the questionnaire, simply review your entry before generating your assessment. Because our questionnaire is complete, state licensing professionals can compel all necessary stakeholders into the same meeting to confirm those facility details with 100% accuracy. By eliminating unnecessary questions, our questionnaire enables state licensing professionals and other stakeholders to correctly and completely capture facility details 4 times faster. And that efficiency is exactly what gives state licensing professionals the right to ask their internal stakeholders to meet more than once a year to reconfirm facility details, knowing that, on average, 10% of facility details change during 1 year. So that's how the Lighthouse AI Facility Assessment Questionnaire solves the problem of capturing changes inside the facility. But it also solves the problem of capturing changes outside of the facility. When agencies add new licenses that apply to new facility details, or they add new facility details to existing licenses, the same team at Lighthouse AI revises or adds questions to the Lighthouse AI questionnaire to correctly capture those additional facility details. Those updates to the questionnaire are immediately pushed out to all of our clients because that questionnaire is in the software. And when facility stakeholders meet again to reconfirm facility details, they'll answer those new questions that determine whether they need the new or changing licensing requirements. And this is critical because 15% of state licensing requirements change each year. That's how the Lighthouse AI Facility Assessment Questionnaire is different from questionnaires created by vendors. Today, we listed many problems that state licensing professionals face when capturing the facility details that determine your requirements. And I'm happy to report that the Lighthouse AI questionnaire solves all of those problems. The benefit is that state licensing professionals comply with 15% more requirements for 3 reasons. First, they correctly capture the 10% of facility details that are commonly entered incorrectly. Second, they recapture facility details at least once a year to catch the 10% that change annually. And third, during each recapture, they identify any new details that may trigger new or changed licensing requirements. Well, how is all of that possible? Because the Lighthouse AI Facility Assessment Questionnaire is complete, concise, and continuously updated. So if you're worried that you may have incorrectly determined licensing requirements because you may have incorrectly captured facility details, or maybe it's been too long since you recaptured your facility attributes, we highly recommend you use Lighthouse AI's state licensing software to manage your state licensing needs. The Lighthouse AI state licensing software is far more than just a questionnaire. Using the answers to each question in your questionnaire, the Lighthouse AI software automatically determines which licenses your facility must acquire, including daily updates for existing, new, and changing requirements. Then the software specifies the tasks that you need to complete for each requirement and tracks the progress of those tasks. Many professionals from both very small and very large organizations now use our software to solve the problems we've outlined today and many more problems that we will discuss in future webinars.
And now we've made it to the Q&A section of the webinar. It's not too late for you to submit questions if you haven't already. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your window. Feel free to submit any questions now. You can submit them anonymously if you'd like to do so. So let's take a look and start answering some of those questions. Sandy, Mark, Tessa, you guys ready to field some questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, great. Let's see what we have here. Sandy, I'm going to throw the first one to you if that's okay. Someone had asked about a change of ownership. They said, "How do I know when a change of ownership needs to be reported?"
That's a good question. Each board has its own criteria for what constitutes a change of ownership. Some agencies will require a new application or notification for very minor changes, while others will only require a new application or notification when there's a majority change of ownership. Ownership changes are really governed at the state level, and they differ depending on the agency.
Great. Thank you, Sandy, for that response. All right, let's see what we have. We have a few other questions here. Sandy, if you don't mind, I'm going to throw one more your way.
Okay.
This person asked, why would a manufacturer need to be licensed as a distributor?
In some states, a manufacturer that distributes its own products is also required to obtain a distributor license. This happens when a manufacturer doesn't outsource its distribution with a 3PL. So even though the entity is operating as a manufacturer, its distribution activities could trigger additional licensure requirements depending on the state's regulatory framework and how they define wholesale and distribution activities.
Awesome. Thank you, Sandy. We have a few more here. Mark, I'm going to throw this one your way if that's okay. Someone had asked, more states are requiring DRs to be the ones submitting license applications. Should they also be responsible for capturing the facility details?
Well, that's a good question, Ryan. When we talk about that, our recommendation is that the person who should be doing that, should be capturing those facility details, should be the person that's currently managing the state licensing for your facility and is the most familiar with the rules and regulations that are out there. It could also be one of the internal stakeholders we mentioned earlier. There really isn't a defined role that has to be. It could be a DR, could be a pharmacist in charge, could be your in-house counsel. But the key point is each of those internal stakeholders should be involved in the process because it takes input from the total group.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. All right, great. Looks like we have a couple questions about the software. So let's take a look at those. And Tessa, I think those are best for you if that's okay.
Great.
Someone asked, how does the Lighthouse AI software update based on new regulations or facility changes?
Sure. Well, generally, you only really need to complete the questionnaire once per facility. After you complete the questionnaire, the software builds a profile of sorts around that facility, and that's what determines your state licensing requirements because we're comparing your facility details to all licensing across all US states and jurisdictions. That's also, we refer to that as an assessment. So these assessments are continuously updating. if a new license requirement is introduced in a state in which you're operating, then the software will automatically notify you of that change and potentially that new requirement. So if at any point your facility were to introduce changes to either your operations or your product portfolio, you're able to update that questionnaire. Luckily, that's super simple. All we have to do is check the boxes for any new states or jurisdictions that you might be shipping into, or new products that you are manufacturing or selling or shipping. And then the software will generate a brand new updated assessment for you so that you're able to easily and quickly determine all of your new and changed licensing requirements.
That's great. Thank you, Tessa.
Mhm.
Um, there's one more software question here. So while I already have you, let's do this one as well. Someone had asked, how often does the software look for changes?
Oh, the software is constantly being updated in real time with new regulatory rules and regulations, legislation, and all other types of information from state regulatory or legislative bodies. So in-house, we have a dedicated team of 6 research professionals, and it's their responsibility to monitor for those regulatory updates and then subsequently alert our clients through our selective notifications and by updating the software. And I want to take a step back because those selective notifications are something that we didn't have time to cover in today's webinar. But basically, the software notifies our clients of any new or changing state licensing requirements directly via these notifications in the software. And those will contain a summary of the change, as well as all of our citations, links to agency websites and portals, and more, just to make sure that as our client, you are able to stay on top of all of these changes.
Perfect. Thank you, Tessa.
You're welcome.
Um, Great. Looks like we do have a couple more questions and we have a few more minutes. So let's see. Someone had asked, and this is either for Mark or Sandy, whoever's most comfortable answering. Someone had asked, how do states handle a move of location? If a resident state takes 2 months to license your new facility, are we expected to not sell to states that require a resident state license?
I can take that one if you want. So in regards to a change of location, that's why it's really important to get the change if you know ahead of time to submit, especially your home state license, at least 60 days prior, so that you're ready for the move. Um, Many licenses are non-transferable, meaning that if there is a change of ownership or a change of address, the license is then null and void. So that's why it is really important to get ahead of the game and start the process of a change of location prior to the actual move. We always recommend at least 60 days in advance.
Great. Thank you, Sandy.
Mhm.
Perfect. Um, Someone else had asked, how does your labeler code or NDA filings impact your distribution model selection? I don't know if we can answer that one live.
I can take that. I don't mind taking
Yeah.
that one.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So your labeler code or NDA filings impact your distribution model. That's where we have your business models. So we give very detailed definitions of what each business model is and the definitions. For instance, a virtual manufacturer, we give a very good definition of what a virtual manufacturer is as opposed to a virtual wholesaler. So with the software, we're able to determine your distribution model based on the business model.
Great. Awesome. Thanks for taking that one, Sandy. Um, I think we just have one more question. Someone had asked, when states ask for CMO information, so contract manufacturer information, is it only focused on the finished product? Or do other factors come into place like packaging, repackaging, I think is what they're asking.
Okay.
Yeah.
So every state is different as far as finished product or unfinished product. In fact, most of them have it in their regulations. If they require a license for a finished product only, or if it's all products in the supply chain, start to finish. So when they're asking for CMO information, they're typically asking for finished product, but the state has certain requirements when they ask for that question. Depending on the state, when they're asking for CMO information, some may require everything in the supply chain or just the finished product. So it really depends on the state because they all have different requirements.
Good answer. And thank you, Sandy. Perfect. I think that's all the questions we have. So we've reached the end of our webinar. So we'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today. And on behalf of the entire team, we want to extend our heartfelt thanks to all of you for your participation and engagement through our polls and all the content today. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and we'll be sharing it tomorrow morning via email. So that'll be ready for you to either rewatch and revisit this content or share with a colleague. So thank you all so much for joining. Hope to see you on the next webinar and have a great day.